shortly. Before we officially start, I just want to remind everyone that if it's okay, this will be recorded. And whilst it's absolutely lovely to see everybody's faces, if you don't want to appear on screen, please just turn your cameras off. As always, we'll make the recording available to everyone after, and it will be posted on our PESP SIG YouTube channel. Next, some very quick ground rules, and these aren't to be taken too seriously, but if anyone needs the toilet, feel free to go at any time. Anytime at all. Nobody's going to be stopping you. Equally, if you want to grab a drink or a bite to eat, anything like that, again, please feel free. This is a completely safe space. No one will judge you for getting an extra biscuit. The only thing we would ask is that if you are munching on a biscuit, please keep your microphone muted until we get to the point whereby you might like to ask a question. And equally, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. And Sarah and I will do our best to keep track of those as we go through. So before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to hand over to Sarah, who will quickly introduce the PESP SIG. Sarah?
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our second pop-up and lock-up event of 2021. So I feel like there's a bit of a strange bit of interference there, but so the PESP SIG is an inclusive group of scholars and practitioners that work to provide a platform for research in PE and sport pedagogy. So as Tom has mentioned, we've got our own YouTube channel, so we'll be posting this to that as well, and obviously any future events will be on there. And we also regularly tweet about news, research and the upcoming events, so please do follow us as well. So myself and my co-convener Annette Stride would like to grow our SIG and have as many people involved as possible. So you can officially join our group by going onto the BERA website under your profile area. So thinking ahead, obviously not to not look forward to what Dillon's going to say, but we have our next event on the 19th of May. So we hope to see as many of you there as possible and obviously join what we've got planned over the summer as well. So now let's get back to Tom to introduce our amazing speaker.
Thank you, Sarah. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second pop-up in lock-up speaker, all the way from the USA and marine world by the looks of it, is Dr. Dillon Landi. Dillon is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology at Towson University in the US, but as of June this year, he's moving to Scotland to be a lecturer in education at the University of Strathclyde. Now, according to a very recent Twitter post, which is where I get all my valid information from, Dillon conducts research on issues of equity and diversity in health and well-being, the moving body, and education. In addition, his work explores social theory, gender, and sexuality. For instance, his PhD from the University of Auckland focused on LGBTQ+ youth experiences in health, physical activity, and educational settings. And in keeping with the theme of award-winning speakers, Dillon was previously awarded the prestigious Paper of the Year award by the journal Physical Education and Sport Pedagogy. And that paper explored queer inclusivity in physical education. So without further ado, I'd like to firstly thank Dillon for agreeing to present and introduce his presentation, which is entitled LGBTQ+ Research in Physical Education, Understanding Our Past, Mapping Our Present, and Planning for a Brighter Future. Over to you, Dillon.
Thanks, Tom. That's a generous introduction, and I'm not sure that I can deliver on that. But first and foremost, I want to thank everybody for showing up. I'm completely shocked by the amount of faces that are here and just really happy to see you. As Tom said, my name is Dillon Landi, and I am currently an assistant professor at Towson University. And starting in June, I will be a lecturer of education at the University of Strathclyde. Before I start, I want to thank the organizing committee here at BERA. I don't know why they asked me to do this when there's so many other amazing folks out there, but I really appreciate the opportunity, and I think they deserve a round of applause just for doing this, which there's an emoji for on this, so we can go ahead and do that. I want to start by saying something that Sarah Ahmed said in 2010. She said, "We are moved by things, and in being moved, we make things." I would not be here without the movements that have been sparked by my mentors. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the role of mentors and mentorship in our field, particularly Katie Fitzpatrick, who supervised my PhD, has been a brilliant mentor for me, has helped me see my work in different ways, as well as my co-supervisor, Richard Pringle, my master's supervisor, Steve Silverman. And as many of you noticed, I came back in the US, and since I came in the US, I've had 3 folks who have really just taken me under their wing, and I want to thank them as well. Jen Walton-Fassett, Sue Sutherland, and Brian Culp. And lastly, I will be joining somebody who's mentored me over the years, and was actually one of my thesis examiners, and that's Professor David Kirk. I also feel the need to thank friends. As we know, whenever we write things or think things, it's not just us, but it's others who influence us. And these 4 folks in particular, I've had chats with about this paper or talk, and they've really challenged me in different ways and made me think about things. So I want to thank Carrie Saffron, who's in the top left. She recently graduated from Teachers College. Tara Blackshear. Tara is my colleague at Towson, and she really pushes me to think in ways that I never had before, and I appreciate her in so many levels. Ollie Hooper is on this list as well. Him and I text via WhatsApp, so I guess that's WhatsApp, not text, but he's pushed my thinking in particular ways, especially around methods. And somebody who has been a really dear friend and co-author to me is Sarah Flory, and she's really challenged a lot of my ideas and made me think about things from a US perspective as well. In New Zealand, we tend to start our talks with something called a whakapapa. And a whakapapa is a genealogy or a history, because it's really important that you know who I am, where I come from, and how that relates to the work that I do. That's me drinking a coffee, by the way, at Panera. I grew up in a small subsection of a town called Radburn, and this section of the town was actually devoted, it was created by FDR and during the Great Depression. It was monies that were allocated in order for working class areas, in order to be more programmatic and livable for particular people. And if you study urban planning in the United States to this day, you study Radburn. So it's a series of connected parks and pathways where kids didn't have to walk to school. They could ride their bikes, or there was filled with ball fields and swimming pools. So essentially, this entire area was created and cultivated an environment in order for kids, and working class kids in particular, to be physically active and to be part of a community. So that really does matter in how I think and what I do. Second, I was a wrestler, and I think it's important that you know that I am a queer man and a queer wrestler. So I was treated very differently when I was in the closet versus when I came out of the closet. And that really has affected the way that I think about sport, physical activity, and health. I was recruited by a small school in North Carolina called Campbell University, and you see a camel there, and that's because it's home of the Fighting Camels, and its name is Gaylord, after the pitcher Gaylord Perry in the USA. But the main thing that really happened for me at Campbell was I actually started as a history and pre-law major, and I met a professor there who is a lesbian woman who took me under her wing and really guided me in different ways. And she is the one who convinced me to be a physical education major. And she said, I really think that you can do this, and it would be great for our field if you came in. So I always think about the fact that I would not be here if not for her and her guidance and her looking out for me in particular ways. From there, I became a teacher. I was a health and PE teacher in New Jersey, right outside of New York City. And I want you to notice that the school that I worked in was considered an urban area. So most of the kids were on free or reduced lunch programs. They are kids who did not look like me. And to be quite honest, most of them spoke Spanish, and I had to pick up things because sometimes they would try and get things around me in different ways. Whilst I was teaching, I was getting my master's degree at Teachers College, which is the Graduate School of Education at Columbia. And I think this is important to talk about because there's sort of a juxtaposition at Columbia because the biobehavioral science department is filled with sort of positivist ideas and traditional ways of thinking, but it's within a college that is actually filled with many people who are pushing the fields of critical theory. So it was there that I first started engaging with critical theory outside of our department in the curriculum and teaching department in particular. From there, whilst I was doing that, I was elevated to a position where I would supervise health and physical education teachers for the Newark Public Schools. Newark, New Jersey is the largest city in New Jersey, and we were learning things at Teachers College around culturally relevant curriculum, how to make sure that our communities and our values are embedded in particular ways. But at Newark, when I took over this position, we essentially didn't do any of the things that we were talking about at Teachers College. And I started wondering, okay, so what could this look like in health education and physical education? And where could I learn about this? So, and in particularly around gender and sexuality. So I looked around the globe and I narrowed it down to a few places. And the place that I chose to go to was the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And this is where I was really influenced by the teacher education faculty there. Obviously, Katie was somebody who influenced me greatly, as well as Richard, but there were other folks on that faculty there that were unbelievable critical pedagogues. And, you know, I think of Rod Philpott, Darren Powell, you know, the whole floor, Alan Ovens, was just filled with critical scholars. Whilst there, I was working with an LGBTQI organization that focused on youth, and they really made me think about what I was doing, how I was doing it. And, you know, sometimes they called me old man, and I didn't think I was that old, but the point was that we really do think differently than kids, and we have to include them on what we do and how we do it. Recently, I've been at Towson University. That's a picture of my dog, Molly. We usually walk around the campus, well, when we could walk around the campus. And Towson's been wonderful because it's the complete opposite of Auckland, but there are people within our department who are critical and resist these things. And I mentioned Tara earlier, but there are others as well. I've also met my partner. This is Kiefer. He's doing his PhD in health economics at Johns Hopkins. So we're talking about one of the most positivist people I've ever met in my life. And it's great that we're under the same household because he really, really makes me think about how I'm doing what I'm doing and what's the impact that I'm doing and if there is any. And starting soon, I will be learning a lot about Scottish education systems, especially around health and well-being, and I'm really excited to do that. Whilst at Teachers College, I got really interested in critical theory. I started off with Judith Butler and gender trouble, and from there you kind of move into Foucault and you read the volume on the history of sexuality. It probably helped that my co-supervisor, Richard Pringle, co-wrote the book Foucault, Sport and Exercise. But in order to get to know Foucault, I started reading the book Foucault by Gilles Deleuze, and I noticed that there was another book that was really big, and this was Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus. And that sort of, I read the first chapter and it sort of sat on my bookshelf. And one time Richard Pringle was walking by and he goes, "Oh, have you read that book?" And I was like, "No, it's a little daunting and tough." And he's like, "Yeah, I'm supposed to write a book review for it. Let's do it together." And that's how I sort of got into materialist theory. But when Katie is your supervisor, and if you haven't read her book, Critical Pedagogy, Physical Education, Urban Schooling, I cannot impress enough that you should be reading it. It's one of the best critical pieces ever. You also get involved with Pierre Bourdieu, who I actually argue in many cases is a materialist, maybe not new materialist, but there are definitely feelings of that. So, and recently I've been engaging with the work of Sarah Ahmed and her idea around queering phenomenology. The reason why I'm pointing this out is because I think it's important that you understand my theoretical trajectory, starting with post-structuralism, especially around feminism, moving into the new materialists and old materialists, I guess you could say, and now back into feminism and intersectional feminism from a phenomenological perspective. So I had this professor at Teachers College. Her name was Michelle Knight, and she used to sit in the back of the class. She taught the research methods class, and we would do this great presentation, and she'd basically say, so what? What does this matter for? Why are we talking about this? And the reason why I say this matters is because our research, our teaching, and all that we do is embodied. It matters that I was a queer athlete. It matters a lesbian professor took me under her wing. It matters that my teaching has with people who don't look like I do and whose cultures are different than mine. It matters that I've been influenced by places like New York City, New Jersey, North Carolina, and New Zealand, and soon to be Scotland. It matters that my engagement with these theoretical texts have shifted the way that I think, because our research is an extension of our bodies, and we extend our bodies into spaces. And for this, I think it's really important to talk about why it matters for LGBTQI issues. This article came out just 2 days ago. Nearly a third of gay people in the United States have attempted suicide. And despite these issues, homophobia is still associated within physical education spaces and continues to occur. So I have 3 tasks in this presentation that I want to undertake. I want to outline a theoretical and critical synthesis of research on LGBTQI issues in physical education. And I want you to know that I'm going to criticize my own work involved in this. I want to think about what queer things, and what I mean by things are people, objects, ideas, practices, that have been left out of our research agenda. And I want to consider if, and maybe even how, those things that we have left out or set aside could actually bolster our research moving forward. To do this, I want to draw on Sarah Ahmed's concepts of orientation, homing devices, and brackets and backgrounds. Before I go into that, I want to argue here that physical education is a social and material space, or as Bergier would say, a field. And if we think of our research, as I stated earlier, as embodied practices, that means that our research extends into these spaces and the physical education field. As such, I really want to think about how LGBTQ research is taken up, or how it's orientated or directed within physical education. But what does it really mean to be orientated? How do we begin to know or feel where we are, where we're going? We line ourselves and our research with the features of the space that we're in. I want everybody to close your eyes real quickly. I'd want you to imagine yourself in a place. Perhaps it's a room that you're familiar with, you're very familiar with. With your eyes closed, put yourself right in that place. What's to your left? What's to your right? What do you see when you look up? Or what's behind you right now? Open your eyes. For me, I always think about my bedroom, and I think about the table that's on the right of my bed. I think about the baseboard behind me. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that orientation is just as much about space as it is about your body in that space and the things or objects that comprise that space. Thus, physical education as a field is filled with familiar objects, ideas, practices. It gives us a sense of familiarity or feeling at home. In other words, this familiarity within the field of physical education, it gives our body the ability to be orientated or directed. However, I want to argue here that this is a co-constitutive relationship. In other words, our bodies and how our bodies extend into these spaces shape the field. So if we consider physical education as an extension of not only our bodies, but the bodies of students, the bodies of parents, the bodies of teachers, the bodies of peer reviewers, we are constantly producing new orientations in our field. Thus, there are these things called homing devices. And what I mean by homing devices, I'm saying that there are practices, objects, ideas that can be productive or reproductive in our field. Let's close our eyes again. I want you to put yourself back into that same space that you just were. But this time, I want it to be dark. Perhaps it's late at night and there's no sun. Maybe you just turned the lights off. For someone who has never been in this space, this can be a really disorientating experience. And we'll get to that notion of disorientation later. But for now, you're in that space. And in order to orientate yourself within this darkness, you may reach out and touch something. It could be a wall. It could be a branch. It could be the corner to the table. Maybe you're smelling a candle in the room and you're moving towards that. Once we grab or smell or feel this thing, this homing device, we now know where we are in the room. Let's open up our eyes again. You see, our familiarity within spaces is gained by the more that we inhabit it. We get used to particular objects, particular smells, particular feelings. Therefore, we develop familiar actions, habits, and objects within a space. The ways that we extend our embodied research into the PE space tends to become familiar. We draw on familiar theories, familiar and similar methods. We ask perhaps questions that have been asked before or just different versions of them. That's because all of these things are homing devices. They give us a sense of familiarity and they direct us into particular research spaces. Therefore, the space has homing devices that affects the shape of our bodies and, importantly, what our bodies can do. But in order to take on these particular directions, we have to turn away other directions. Therefore, our research itself takes on an orientation. And the objects, the people, and the practice that we engage with, they're the ones that we're drawn to with our orientation. Qualitative methods might be drawn to interviews. Quantitative methods might be drawn to surveys. Therefore, the orientation that we take gives us an idea of what we are doing and embodying and what our direction is going towards. But in order to do this work, we have to put aside other things or relegate it, and this might be objects, people, or places, and put it to the background. Thus, these things that we bracket, we often overlook, but they reside within our field. So, my question is, what if these things that we put to the background or overlook are things that we should actually be turning to? In other words, what if these bracketed things, objects, people, practices, theories, habits, are actually the very stuff that can disorientate and transform the field of physical education? So just to summarize here, when we're talking about an orientation, we're talking about a familiarity. They are directions that place us on particular ways of thinking and being in the world. And our orientation comes with homing devices, practices, people, objects that shift us towards some orientations, but away from others. and we tend to align with those objects and things and practices that we are drawn toward too. But in order to take that direction, we have to bracket or overlook or relegate some things to the background. But this bracket is actually filled with plenty of potential. So I may have outlined 3 tasks earlier, but I have one goal here. And I want to find out what is queer within LGBTQIA research that we may have overlooked. I want us to think about how we can use that queerness, that stuff, that could actually shift the current orientation in PE more broadly. To do so, I make 3 specific arguments. I argue that LGBTQIA research in PE is primarily aimed at or orientated toward agendas of inclusivity as the main goal of research. In fact, that paper that Tom was talking about earlier is named toward a queer inclusive PE. So I am part of this orientation. But in order to be included, we've situated our research within the orientation of the field of physical education. Therefore, the homing devices within PE have actually directed us towards some things, and these are methods, theories, participants, goals, at the expense of others. And I argue we need to disorientate our own research within PE by turning to the background and unleashing this potential of those bodies that have been set aside or overlooked. I argue there are 4 homing devices that have really orientated PE research on LGBTQI issues. They have been research on attitudes, perceptions, and climates, teacher experiences, teacher education, and research on student experiences. Across the world, there's been heterosexist, homophobic, and derogatory remarks being documented in PE classes by multiple authors. In fact, between 79% and 91% of students and teachers have stated that they've witnessed these behaviors either sometimes or often. Yet in the United States, Spain, and Canada, the students don't believe that teachers are actually doing enough to address these issues. Therefore, other places like New Zealand and Australia have documented a lack of empathy from teachers. Clearly, a lot of this research is on attitudes, the perceptions, and the climates of PE. Importantly, men tend to have higher or increased rates of homophobia compared to their female colleagues or women colleagues. Physical education majors in universities are more likely to be homophobic than other majors at universities in the United States, Turkey, and New Zealand. Larson and colleagues found that teachers, so these PE majors that become teachers later on, right? They tend to have gendered expectations of their students, reinforcing the idea that heterosexuality is the normal sexuality. And they argued later on that PE acts as a heterosexual matrix where students are expected to act straight. Now, whilst this was not research, a really great conceptual article by Fitzpatrick and McGlashan argued that pedagogy is straight pedagogy. And actually that was a book chapter. But I want to argue here, there are some of these disorientations there. Youth do subvert these expectations through activities like dancing in classes. So a lot of these attitudes, perception, and climate studies have actually no theory, with the exception of, I would say, Larson, Sykes, and McGlashan, really. And the predominant methods that were used were questionnaires and interviews, with the exception of Larson, who did observations. Other considerations that we have to think about here: the attitudes and perceptions climate research was predominantly done with people who don't identify as LGBTQIA. So the research on LGBTQIA issues from an attitudes, perceptions, and climate issues did not actually work with, for the most part, queer students or queer people. And when it was with queer people, none of them were actually young people. They were always adults that reflected on their experiences looking back. So what's the orientation of this research? It's been geared towards identifying that there's a problem in PE with homophobia, heteronormativity, and heterosexism. This, however, has been influenced by a homing device within physical education more broadly that sits within that research on attitudes, climates, and physical education spaces. Therefore, the work of Biddle, Silverman, Solomon, Tannehill. And much of these approaches, not all, but a lot of them, were grounded in post-positivism. So what has been bracketed here? With little exception, theoretical advances in the field. And I spoke about those earlier. Observations, again, with little exception. Multimodal methods. Observations, interviews, questionnaires, that's it. And actual LGBTQI young people. Bracketed, overlooked. The second homing device was research on lesbian and gay educators. Lesbian educators have been documented to be physically harassed, verbally harassed, property destruction, fired for coming out, all these horrendous things that were happening in the 90s and even prior. Lesbian teachers often had to conceal their sexuality from their students and their colleagues. And lesbian educators were also afraid in a subject that focuses on the body to actually touch and maneuver bodies with young people. One of the things that I always find interesting is that the 3 different studies in 3 different places argued that lesbian teachers built barriers between their personal and workplace, and they called it 3 different things: a public-private divide, living in 2 worlds, and living a double life. That's how prevalent this was. And lesbian identities within physical education were constructed in highly constrictive ways, despite the number of lesbian educators in our field. Notably, recent research has shown that things have improved, and in many cases, teachers have worked to resist these dominant narratives, and sometimes by letting students take the lead. As such, lesbian PE teachers may have also become to be realized as role models and moral leaders that are compassionate and advocates for LGBTQI young people. So, what are some things here? Well, the early work did not use theory to guide the design or analysis of studies. The later work did. Methods. The predominant mode of inquiry here: interviews and life history approach. In rare cases, I think one, Harrison Griffin, 1992, they used a questionnaire. But considerations we have to make here: participants were predominantly white lesbian women from suburban areas. We never get a sense on how this actually affected teaching and pedagogy. And we only examined these teachers' experiences in schools. You know, it's interesting that we talk about double life or living a double life or public-private divide or living in 2 worlds. But the fact is that those 2 worlds are not 2 worlds. It's 1 world interconnected, and they affect each other. But we never talk about how they affect each other. So what's the orientation here? This research has been geared towards identifying that lesbian educators face insurmountable odds to be successful in schools. And whilst in the homing device here is that whilst not using the same theory, a lot of this was similar to the occupational socialization stuff around teachers and their experiences in schools, not to mention the early work around life history approaches that was led by Sparks, Templin, and Schempp. So what did we relegate to the background here, or what was bracketed? Diverse races, ethnicities, genders, and sexualities. We know nothing really about bisexual teachers, transgender teachers. Actually, I just came across something 2 days ago written by an educational curriculum person in University of British Columbia, and he found documentation of a trans well, what we would say trans now, but transsexual at the time, PE teacher being fired despite being teacher of the year in the 1970s, physical education in California. But we rarely know anything. Again, multimodal and creative methods, gone, bracketed. Teachers from different countries. The majority of these studies were Canada, the USA, and the UK. But the entire queer cultures of these lesbian women were completely bracketed. They weren't discussed. They weren't even really investigated. The third homing device that I talk about is teacher education. In 2000, Flintoff, who did, I can't find another one. I think this might be one of the earliest ethnographies on teacher education. She argued that programs in the UK are influenced by discourses of masculinities and femininities, and it made it really hard for women, lesbian women, and gay men to exist in these programs. McCaughey in 2019 in Canada did a master's thesis stating that PEEP programs are still dogged by these issues of heteronormativity, homophobia, and heterosexism. Joe Clark talked about how lesbian PE majors are actually out on their university campuses, but hid their identity in their majors and their practicums and going out to student teach. But there's also been another side to this teacher education research that I find to be a line of flight, or something that's really interesting that we need to look into more. In the early 2000s, Chapman worked with Sykes at the University of Wisconsin, and they developed a play to present to their PE majors to show the struggles that lesbian PE teachers go through. But when they showed this play to the PE majors, they were very resistant to it. I think one of the lines was, "It's too in your face." Perez, Samaniego, and the folks at the University of Valencia developed a narrative that they presented to their PE majors around transgender experiences in PE. And there was sort of a continuum of reactions to this. Some were very resistant, actually called transgender persons as diseased ailments. Another group of people sort of felt like, well, this is a population that's at risk, and it's our moral obligation to take care of them. So sort of looking at it from a deficit approach, abjection and alterity. And then others, few were saying, nope, we need to make sure that these folks are actually part of our class. So the idea that we have to shift, teacher education majors. Davis, again, University of Valencia, built on this work and integrated a queer tango. And by queer tango, I mean men took on feminine roles within tango, and women took on masculine roles, or men dance with men or women dance with women. And a lot of the students actually talked about how they enjoyed expressing themselves in different gender performances, but there was still reluctance to it, and why they should do this and what this means for inclusivity. And notably, McCaughey and Fletcher said that a lot of the students that are in teacher education programs are showing a willingness to teach about queer issues, but they're not doing it because they're not taught how. So a little different here. Queer and post-structural theories are throughout. The methods are so diverse around creating plays, narratives, doing dances, interviews, observation, responses. So we're seeing things branch out a little bit, but we have to recognize that these were studies of opportunity. They were at their own schools, right? And they weren't, intense, long-term critical projects where we looked at things, how can we queer physical education long-term, but they were one-off activities. So we really don't know what they did long-term or what effects they had. And again, with these, a lot of the studies bracketed and really didn't talk about LGBTQI people in different ethnicities, but they were targeted towards straight folks. So what's the orientation here? To examine and critique the homophobic culture of PE programs, to shift the perceptions of specific PE majors before they teach, And as a homing device, this work aligns with critical and sociocultural analysis on teacher education, the work by Kirk, Tinning, and Wright, but it also aligns with the more recent work around social justice pedagogies, especially and policies, Blackshear and Culp, Flory, I'm missing a bunch of people, Walton Fassett, Hill, Philpott, Gurdon. So, but there's many people who are doing this work. So again, that's a homing device that's orientating how that work is being set up. But again, in the background, diverse ethnicities, genders, sexualities, studies in different settings other than your own, and a lack of instruction on actually how to teach teachers how to be queer pedagogists or how to be inclusive. The last homing device is around student experiences. And I think Sykes in 2011 did a great job arguing the ethos of the book in a single sentence. Lesbian, bi, and gay sexualities were rarely constructed as legitimate, valued, or positive in physical education settings. And so many results here that were deep and rich, but I just want to highlight a few. LGBTQ, these LGB students sat out of PE, they avoided it, and they dropped PE classes. And something that I always found interesting about this book was they talked about how the body and the stereotypes and discourses about the body were actually opposite. So in gay culture in Canada and North America at that time, being a gay man, being slim and slender is actually holds high capital in the gay community. But for a man to be slim and slender in physical education, that holds low capital. And the same could be said in different lesbian communities with body types and how they're opposite and they juxtapose each other. McGlashan in 2013, this is a really great study. If you haven't read it, it was her master's thesis. It won the National Master's Thesis of the Year in New Zealand. She worked with LGBTQ, or gay men rather, and reflecting on their experiences in physical education. And they were called faggots, they were bullied by students, and they were harassed by teachers. But the real nugget in this, this study was that their friends who were in these classes actually protected them. And I think that's an area that we've really underexplored. And aligning with previous work, McGlashan noted that lockers/changing rooms are dangerous. Caldwell worked with two trans men. They enjoyed physical activity outside of PE, but they didn't like PE. And they also talk about how gender as a structured principle in lines and bathrooms and all these different things affected their experiences in negative ways. And Dennison and Kitchen did an international report, and a small part of that report focused on physical education, and LGB students really disliked PE and they were bullied in it. So the other thing around student experiences is my work with young people. And I'm just going to highlight it here. The thesis is here, but I'm making a lot of changes and I'm revising a lot of these ideas for the forthcoming book with Rutledge. So I'm just going to talk about some of these, but things are changing as well. So PE was restricted by multiple binaries, a biomedical binary that put male and female, pathological binary where bodies were either healthy or unhealthy, mind-body or Cartesian dualism where the mind is seen as superior to the body because it's rational and the body's animalistic. And, you know, the body being animalistic usually refers to sexual desire, and therefore LGBTQI people get pushed into that area. But notably, there are a lot of pedagogies that go against young people's culture, and specifically rainbow culture in Aotearoa. One of them was competitive team sports. A lot of these kids noted that we are dealing with issues that a lot of folks are not. We are under a lot of pressure. When we come into a place with our friends and with classmates, we don't need to compete against them. We want to be supported by them. Another thing was fitness testing. They would split bodies up by, you know, male and female. They would be ultra competitive. A paper that I'm working on right now with Sri Lynch and Carrie Saffron really examines this. And then the body shaming approaches. I have to bring this one up. So I wasn't going to talk about this, but I have to. One kid was explaining a booklet that they were doing in physical education. So they had to calculate their BMI. And then there was a continuum of bodies with a skinny, well, like muscular, okay body over here, and then a few different bodies, and then a really fat body over here. And this student had to calculate their BMI, and then they had to circle the body that best represented their BMI and their body according to this continuum. So think about, there's one kid in particular who was very heavy. And then after circling that, they had to give this booklet to their friends so that their friends could ensure that they were circling the right body and that they were calculating their BMI correctly. So just an idea of some of the things that these students were facing. So what do these practices do? 59 of 60 of the youth in my study dropped out of physical education. They felt bad about their bodies and their identities, and they were bullied. So student experiences in PE have been informed by queer, post-structural, and new materialist methods or theories. Methods, again, primarily interviews, questionnaires, and ethnography. And other considerations here. These were primarily adults reflecting on their experiences, with the exception of my paper or my thesis. It was focused primarily on experiences in PE alone. And I make this problem as well, and I don't connect it to lives outside of school. I make that separation again, and I did a really poor job of that, I feel like. It's been very qualitative driven, and it's been primarily in 3 different places: Spain, Canada, and New Zealand. And we think about why, because of access. And when we think about the orientations that we take, certain bodies and certain topics, because of the place that we're in, we have access to. So what's the orientation? To examine how, and to be specific, to examine the bad experience that LGBTQI students have in PE. And this work aligns with the humanist approaches that seek to understand human experiences, but especially around sociocultural issues. And you see, I know Azarito's work, Fitzpatrick, Oliver, Penny, Powell, and again, many others. I only have a short slide, and I don't want to put everybody on there because I'm cutting to the end of it here. And in the background, again, diverse queer folks, diverse queer youth. We know nothing really about intersex, bisexual, asexual, just to give you an idea. Different countries. Students' identities and lives outside of school, completely bracketed, overlooked. Observational research. It's very hard for us to get into those gyms. Student voice, listening to their ideas on how to transform and make this better. And throughout the entire thing, there were very little mentioning of policies in physical education. And one of the things that came up, and I talk about in the book, is how uniforms have a material affect on young queer bodies, and in particularly women. So when thinking about this, I think of Sarah Ahmed's point that you find out very quickly what you aim to bring an end to, some do not even recognize as existing. And I brought this up when I was introducing Katie in her AERA lecture, and I again think that all of you should look at that. Basically, the forms of isms that we seek to end, racism, sexism, and in our case, homophobia and heteronormativity, there are many people in our field who don't even think exist or is a problem. Therefore, the orientation of our research has been to prove that there's a problem. But when you expose a problem, you pose a problem. And it might be assumed that the problem would just go away if you would stop talking about it, or if you or we went away. My point here is homophobia is not seen as the problem in PE for many in the field. The problem are the people who are doing the research on homophobia. The problem are the people who are doing research on racism. The problem are the people who are doing research on social class. Therefore, our goal of pointing out this problem has made us the problem. So our orientation in the field tends to pose problems for PE, but many of those problems have been orientated by the homing devices within physical education itself as a field. But when we think about it, physical education research and practice, has done very little to actually solve many of our own other lingering problems doing these same things. But why? Well, because of our alignment to PE, we reproduce the homing devices and the problems that we've had. Our use of theories are often devoid of diverse queer, race, and post-colonial and intersectional approaches. Our methods tend to treat research as objective, which is impossible. And therefore, instead of trying to change and solve and transform problems, we are trying to understand them. In order to align to these dominant theories, methods, and teaching practices, LGBTQI research in particular has actually had to bracket the very queer culture that makes us who we are as people and as communities. But what if we turn to the background? What if we, rather than bracketing and overlooking these things, we turn to them? I think about the work of Oliver Hooper and Tom and Rachel creating comic books to explain and look into these things to transform different areas. I think of Carrie Saffron's work where she's collaging and making scrapbooks with young people in New York City. I think of Bonnie Pang's recent work that's coming out right now that's using film and video to explore the intersection of Chinese identities. Multimodal, transformative methods that engages with diverse countries and cultures. We draw on new theories and we not bracket the outside and personal lives, but we include those things into physical education, like these queer and racially diverse organizations. We think about curriculum and pedagogy and how to create queer pedagogical approaches. We can use arts-based inquiry. We do long-term work with PE majors. We work to transform by working with our youth rather than on our youth. So when we think about Michelle Knight, and she's sitting in the back of class, and I see her right now, she's going, so what? Why does this matter? It matters because in aligning ourselves to the field, we may be posing problems, but we're also reproducing the same mechanisms that make the field the way that it is. Therefore, we need to use our subjectivities, our cultures, our diverse identities to reorientate the field. And I'm going to throw a few suggestions here. And like I said, this paper, it's under revision and it will continue to be under revision. Right now it's under revision at a journal, and I don't want to say which one, because if it gets rejected from that journal, I don't want everybody to be like, yo, he's been rejected, which happens all the time for me, by the way. So a few things. I think we really need to think about curriculum and teaching strategies that can actually solve problems. And we need to conduct research to see what these approaches actually do rather than describe what they are. I think we need to work with people, cultures, spaces, and objects that are beyond the school. This includes communities, organizations, and That's because they have a different set of knowledge, experiences, and material circumstances that can help us inform that curriculum, that pedagogy, those policies to think differently. Like others in the field have been starting to do, we need to focus on youth voice and make sure that it's diverse youth voice, not just the folks that we have studied on the past few years. We need to connect research in physical education to the personal and home lives of young people. These things are interconnected and they affect each other. We cannot think that phys ed occurs in a vacuum that is separate than the fact that some of these LGBTQIA students are living on streets. 40% in New Zealand at the time I did this, 40% of homeless youth identified as LGBTQIA, 40%. And they're going to schools. We have to think about those things. Something that I've been really inspired, and two people who have pushed me on this is Tara and Katie. We need to examine positive examples that actually address LGBTQIA issues in constructive ways. And when I say positive examples, I think the youth need to define what is positive. We can't just say, oh, we know this teacher is good, so it's positive. We have to think about, you know, talking with LGBTQI youth, find good places and look into those things. And the main point that I want to make here, and I think this is the point that I'm trying to make more broadly, is that the field of physical education has unbelievable opportunity. And I think it's why I'm in this field to begin with. We're not like maths and literacy, where we are restricted by standardized tests and standards and outcomes in particular ways. Teachers have a sense of autonomy, and there is a lot of leeway. Yet, despite this autonomy and despite this leeway, we've done very antiquated methods and practices, and they've continued a long time, as Kirk would say, as sport technique, or as Kennerstedt would say, as attached to health. My question is, given queer culture and all of the amazing things that we're good at, how can we take that creative culture and merge it with that autonomy in order to create an innovative, creative, and experimental physical education? So rather than following and fitting into an orientation, how can we turn to the background in order to disorientate or queer the current physical education agenda? Or better put, instead of us trying to be more like them, why don't we do research, practices, and programs that forces them to be more like us? Thank you. And as I said, this is one of those things that's currently under construction, and I'm really looking forward to feedback. So any questions, comments, suggestions, I'd really appreciate. So thanks, everybody. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dillon. I, for one, thoroughly enjoyed that. I think you absolutely crushed it. I mean, yeah. It felt to me at the end there like I was watching a documentary. It was so polished, mate. I really, really, really enjoyed that. So thank you so much. We've got exactly half an hour left for questions.
I did that purposefully.
You're a clever man. For questions, comments, feedback, anything like that. So I will open it up. There's two ways of doing it. We can have a complete free-for-all and people can just turn their mics on and then chat, or you can raise your hand if that function still exists, and then we'll come straight to you. So any questions?
It worked. Or suggestions. Like I said, this is currently being thought of and thought of again.
And equally, people could post a question in the chat if anyone wants to. There we go. Shri, after you.
Hi, Dillon. Thank you. Hi, on behalf of me and Ruby.
I was about to say hi to Shri and Ruby.
Thank you for that. We both loved it. It was, yes, throughout the presentation, I just constantly saying, yes, 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 I agree. And you said something though, and it kind of made me go, oh, I hope he goes back to that. And you were talking about how you're going to change your thinking and change something in the book that you didn't do previously. And I wondered whether you could just expand on that for us, like what has changed for you, and what was it that made that change for you?
So there are two things that I think I did a really bad job of in my thesis. And I know we're all our worst critics. I did a bad job of connecting the personal and home life of my kids to what's going on, not my kids, but our kids, you know, to what goes on in physical education. And I think it's really important that we turn to that background, right? Because that is a background that teachers and, you know, myself sometimes, we tend to overthink or overlook, or we don't even consider it in many cases. And I didn't consider it enough in my studies. And while I've been constructing my book, I've been revisiting data, and the amount of things that the people that informed what I got to write talked about around their families, around their ethnicities, because a good portion were Maori and Pacifica. Because of my own shortfalls and my own short-sightedness, I didn't include. And I have to tell you, Tara has really pushed me to really think about that as a colleague. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and there's really nothing I can do about this in regards to my thesis, but moving forward, is that I think my research has to make a difference. I think it has to lead to change. We tend to think about these things. I think it's because of the way that I was raised in the US in that post-positivist sort of line. We tend to try and put our hand up and say, oh, we need to be objective. We need to be objective. And none of this is objective. It's all subjective, and I'm subjected to it because I'm so involved in it. So now that I have an understanding of what some of the issues are, some, not all, how can we work with youth in order to transform those things? And that's something that I'm really looking forward to doing in my future work. I hope that answered your question. Okay, thumbs up. And give Ruby a pat for me.
Dillon, there's a question in the chat from Chloe. Can you make any suggestions to how we can solve these problems instead of just trying to make ourselves and the students understand? Yeah, and I think that this is where the future research has to go. I think we need to work with students. These students are so bright. You know, in the United States, we have, you know, stock market, everybody's making money, yada, yada, yada. And they put a bunch of money into this GameStop, I think is the name of it. And they threw off the entire market, and all these young kids literally made hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single day, right? So these kids learned a sophisticated stock market system, which, by the way, I know nothing about. They knew how to manipulate it for their own well-being. And what they did was they did the things that people have been doing for years around manipulation of markets, but they figured it out as 15, 16, and 17-year-olds. So my point is, if they can figure stuff like that out at that age, why aren't we going to them
to figure out how to solve the physical education issue. And this is based off of my work in 2018 in that first paper, and a follow-up in 2019. I think that we need to include youth in developing curriculum. I think we need to include youth in developing policies. I think we need to include youth in developing, you know, in the United States, we're focused on standards and things like that. So starting with them, starting with their practices, because they are the ones who know how to be relevant to youth culture. That is a culture, and we have to respond to it. So I don't think there's one cookie cutter way is the answer. I think that we have to engage with the youth of each individual context and place and work with them.
Thank you. Lots of questions appearing in the chat now. So you'll see another one from your namesake, another Dylan. So the question there is, if we turn to the background to transform whatever it might be, are we then backgrounding something else which may have untapped or unintended potentialities for the transformation of whatever it is?
Yeah, so no matter what decision, and you know, this is basic, right? I teach this to my first years. No matter what decision you do or whatever approach you take, there are always positives and negatives to that approach, right? So whatever orientation or whatever objects or things that we turn to in the background, there's going to be positives to that and there's going to be negatives to that. But the reason why I think we need to turn to the background specifically in this is because we have done it. We've been on a particular direction. We've been on a particular orientation for quite some time. And we know that there are issues with this orientation. Therefore, what we are turning our backs on, and I hate to say it like that, but because you never fully turn your back on something, it comes with you. It's always part of you and it pushes you into that direction as you extend into that space. What we are putting to the background may be some of the things that didn't work in the past, and we're experimenting with new things. That's one. Number two, within a particular space, we all take different orientations. I think that Katie's AERA talk really discussed this fabulously about the different ontological strands that we currently deal with. And if you haven't seen this chat, you need to go see it. It's on YouTube and it's on the podcast that Risto publishes. So no matter what, there's always going to be different people taking different orientations. My issue is I think that there are dominant orientations, and that I think that we need to queer or disorientate those dominant ones. And the way to do that is by turning to the background. And what that does is that it never actually turns away from the field. It shifts the orientation of the field slightly over time, and it continues to do that.
Thank you. And thank you, Dylan, for the question. So there's one other question that's appeared. There we go. So one other question that's popped in there from Julia, who says, I felt as if you alluded to an impression that this type of research is perhaps a bit risky or even not always well received because it jars with the norm. What were your biggest reflection points from this research space, perhaps those that you learned very quickly that others could learn and build from?
I think my biggest reflection is we need to be, if we think of our research as embodied, right, as us extending into particular spaces, that means multiple bodies are extending to carve out a space. And I think that we need to do things that benefit young people and are orientated towards young people. And I think that in many cases, that goes against what we're expected to do as scholars, right? And this is particularly the case in the United States, especially at major Research One universities, where what really matters is pumping out as many publications as possible and getting in as much grant money as possible. And in the United States, that's related to making fat kids skinny and skinny kids skinnier, right? So I think that the main thing is that, yeah, it's jarring and this is hard work, but it's the work that actually has the ability to be transformative. And I think that the type of work of the pumping out as much as you can, I don't think that can be as transformative as we can be. The other thing that I think is important is that we need to include queer culture in things, not just queer culture, but the different forms of queer cultures, like Black queer culture, right? Maori or Fa'afine queer culture. We need to explode on this, and we need to recognize that physical education is not about shaping, or as Mikkel Kennerstedt would say, shaping children or changing children, but it's about giving children and empowering children through different cultural ways to see health as something that we can learn, and as a cultural site rather than a dominating site.
Fabulous. Thank you. There may be more questions coming in. I simply can't keep up.
Dylan, if you like the term experimenting, the other, okay, I can't say, Kathleen Quinn-Livin has an excellent book on experimentation in health and sexuality education. And it's really taught me so much. She recently passed away, and this was like her final sort of book, and it is a doozy. It's so good. I learned so much. So I would just check that out. Quinn-Livin.
So I think there's a question in there for you, Dylan, from Teresa, who's wondering, is giggling. Do you know each other?
No, I'm reading the question, and I'm agreeing with it. Sorry.
I'll read it out for the sake of the recording and my sanity. So I'm wondering about trauma in research. As you mentioned, research is an extension of ourselves and our bodies, and this may mean we are researching our traumas through our research. I'm seeing this now in a research project I'm working on with professional male hockey players, both unsaid amongst participants, but becoming lived amongst the team. Have you given consideration, taken up, or does trauma remain in the background?
Okay, two things. Research is extremely personal and it's embodied. There's a quote that I always say by Foucault, where he says, you know, I worked my whole life like a dog. I did that to be changed. And what he's saying is that the research process is personal and it is embodied and it is transformative for us. There are folks who refer to it as me-search, not research, right? There's a reason why I do the type of research that I do. I think that when it comes to trauma, first of all, we don't know enough on this topic, in particular with LGBTQIA folks. And something that I find interesting is the ethical dilemma around trauma when you're doing this research. This is the second time I'm talking about this week. One of the participants in my study, I see his face clearly. He lived on the street, and the things that this kid had to do to get a home for the night was some of the most traumatic things that I had encountered. And I didn't even know how to deal with it at the time. I remember thinking, I have to bring this kid home. The point that I'm trying to make is there's this ethical balance that we have to carry. And if research is ethical, and I don't mean ethical as in like informed consent and that type of stuff, I mean the actual ethical stuff, we have to address trauma. And we have to address how trauma is not only something that occurs within a space, but how trauma is carried with us in particular spaces, and how our own trauma affects what we do and how we do it. This particular kid, I'll never forget. I remember having really deep conversations with Katie about this. He used to have to use hookup apps just to get a place to live at night. And I remember just trying to get him into different spaces, and I wasn't allowed to for different reasons, or we opened up different options and services. But how do you address that when there's so many things that are going on in our field? And I don't think that we're aware or informed that our students are going through this. And this goes back to the thing that I overlooked, is that how those things affect our experiences in PE and in schools and in health and well-being more broadly. Sorry. Yeah, I think we have to unpack it, and I think we have to learn to address it much stronger in different ways.
Thank you, Dillon. Does anyone else have any additional follow-up questions, comments, thoughts, feedback? Or has everyone taken this opportunity to go and get the biscuit that I said was completely okay in this safe space?
Dillon, I have a quick question for you. I appreciate what you presented today. As always, wonderfully presented and thought-provoking. When we look at the research that you spoke about, and then some of the stuff that I'm starting to get into, where we look at ableism, you know, it's not sexy with regard to funding. What strategies or suggestions do you have for folks that want to do this? Going back to your comment before about, you know, the R1s and the parish or publish or perish kind of a comment, for seeking out funding that allows us to do this work in a comprehensive way without sabotaging ourselves, so to speak.
Yeah, so I think this is a nuanced question because it's very contextually based. In the USA, there's so many restrictions to getting this type of funding, flat out. Being a qualitative researcher in the United States, you might as well just put your name on a list that says, don't fund me, right? There's probably a list that looks like that. Being a critical qualitative researcher in the USA, it's probably even another list that says, you know, that person's a whack job. I'm definitely on that list, but probably for other reasons. In spaces like New Zealand, they do fund this stuff. In spaces like Australia, there's ARC funding. In spaces like the UK, I've noticed that a lot of the way that these grants have been sort of couched is in well-being and in health. So not we're going to change kids and make them healthy, but we are going to teach about, and hopefully through this, we can make a contribution to well-being, but not making like these definitive claims that have to be made in the States, it feels like. My question is, how can you work with teams of people from different spaces and think about funding not only as contextually in the US for you in particular, but how can you work in spaces where it's international? Because there are international funding opportunities with teams of people who work interdisciplinary, but also across borders. So that would be my first thing if it comes down to the US. The second thing about the US is just have a stats person handy. My partner's one of those, so.
Yeah. No, I was thinking the exact same thing as you were talking. I'm like, yes, but that gives us a great look at what the, as you know, qualitatively, what the situation might be in New Zealand or might be in the UK, but what about our kids in the US? And collaborative teams might be one of the only ways to get a big kind of overarching, better understanding, as well as potentially a new model or a new theory and a way of examining things.
But the other part about this, and I really think that this is something that we don't do, right? And we always say, well, the funding mechanism's this, the funding mechanism's this. Well, the funding mechanism are developed by politicians, they're developed by leaders in the field, they're developed by, like Shape America, for example, has a huge connection with the CDC and has a huge connection with other funding areas. It's their job to educate. And they should be educating about the different forms and what the purpose is of physical education. And I think that's one of the problems specific to the United States, is that physical education is seen as an instrument to change kids to be healthy. That is what it is. And part of that is because massive organizations and some of our top scholars in the US have jumped on that bandwagon, and it has given them funds and it has made their careers better at the expense of actual children, right? So what is the role of our national organization to step up and, you know, talk to politicians and say, actually, by the way, I know that you guys want us to make fat kids skinny and skinny kids skinnier, but that's not our jobs. We are educators. We're not fitness instructors. But the problem is that they're vested in that. And right now they're vested in the social and emotional learning. But the fact is that that's been heavily critiqued. The major model is the Castle model, right? That's been majorly critiqued for not addressing sociocultural issues. And actually the person who was kind of the leader on the Castle model, he came out with a paper saying, yep, we missed that. You have to integrate that type of stuff on your own in order for it to be socially and culturally relevant. But that is what is being driven right now, money-wise, in the US, and therefore that is what SHAPE and others are latching their bandwagon. Sue Sutherland refers to it as ambulance chasing. They see the ambulance and they run after it because that's where the money is. So education, how do we educate these funding agencies? That's our job as well too.
All day and every day that ends in a Y.
Thank you, Susanna. Does anyone else have any questions? We've got 7 minutes left. Any final thoughts, questions? Are there any left in the chat that I've missed? Don't think so. Last chance. Okay, if there's no final pressing questions, then again, I'd just like to thank Dillon for a fantastic presentation.
Thanks for having me. I'm still shocked you invited me.
really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. I can see the party poppers are going, hands are waving, there's virtual clapping, lots of thanks going on. So thank you, Dillon, again for this. Providing that I've had no technical glitches and that there's a backup recording of this, we will make this available on the YouTube channel for anyone who couldn't access it. And I do apologize because there was a message for somebody to access it that I couldn't get to because I'm recording my screen and I didn't want my text to pop up everywhere. So we'll try and make this available as soon as possible and then tweet it out so that everyone can access it again. But thank you, Dillon. I've no idea what time it is where you are, to be honest. What?
It's 11:54 a.m. So it's noon. So I'm about to go have lunch.
Okay, or brunch. If it's still 11, technically, you can count that as brunch, definitely.
I once had brunch with Debbie Harry, who is the lead singer of Blondie. We were in a cafe in New York. She was 2 tables away from me, but you know, and she doesn't know that I had brunch with her, but I had brunch with her. We're both drinking mimosas.
It still counts. If there's line of sight, definitely counts.
100%.
So thank you again, Dillon, for your fantastic presentation, and we'll make this available and tweet it out to everyone and send the link to everyone that's registered to attend after. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Honestly, mate, fantastic presentation.
Can we stop recording?
Yeah,
I'm like all nervous. Oh my God. Oh.
Honestly,
I get so nervous. I get so nervous.